What's going on, guys? Billy here, and yes, you read that title right. After 5 months, DJI has finally made the Mavic 3 complete through what I would call the final big firmware update that adds a long list of great new features. So this update version 01.00.0642 was released on Tuesday, May 31st, and has a patch note list that is 15 bullet points long. Some of these only introduced changes for the Mavic 3 Cine, as noted, were applicable, but regardless, there is a lot to unpack in this update, so if you want to take a second to read these patch notes, go ahead and pause the video. But now what I want to do is get outside and show you some of the larger changes that were introduced firsthand. So the first listed change in these patch notes is a complete overhaul to the tele camera here on the Mavic 3, which is just an absolute huge change. I think that I can speak for a majority of the Mavic 3 owners when I say that it always felt handicapped. Like, I felt like the telephoto lens was cool to use mid-flight to zoom in and see what was down there on the ground and get a closer look at, what's further away from the drone. But the photos and videos that were actually captured from that camera and then saved to the SD card were never really all that good. So with this overhaul, things on the display within the DJI Fly app have changed a little bit. You now have the ability to snap right to the 7x zoom of the tele camera, and Explorer mode has been moved into the list of different shooting modes. When you select Explorer mode, you'll be able to then zoom in digitally all the way up to 28 times, but to take advantage of the different shooting modes the tele camera can now use, Explorer mode will need to be disabled. This means that once we jump out of that Explorer mode, it's going to allow us to use all of the sub shooting modes that we're used to using on the main camera, like auto exposure bracketing, burst, and time shot. We even have the ability to manually adjust our exposure and capture raw photographs. So the way this works is basically whatever shooting mode that you're in, you can freely switch between the main camera and the tele camera to capture the same exact photos, from shooting mode to exposure adjustment to the file format, either RAW or JPEG. Now the same is true for video as well, so we can choose from a wider range of image resolutions and frame rates, and we can even manually adjust our exposure. So of course the aperture is locked in at 4.4, but you can adjust the ISO and shutter to properly expose the video that you're shooting. I always thought that having the tele camera and being able to use Explorer mode was fun, like I had mentioned before we just went over all of these new features. It was cool to kind of be further away from a highway, zoom all the way into a car and track it as it was going down the highway from a further distance away, but it was just kind of that, right? It was just a fun feature to use, and you never really wanted to share those photos and videos. But now things have changed, especially when using the 7x zoom and snapping to the full resolution of that tele camera. Being able to shoot raw photos, being able to use different shooting modes like auto exposure bracketing, it really is going to change the game and make that 7x zoom a lot more usable. Okay, so moving on from there is probably my second favorite addition, and that is the ability to now shoot HLG video. Before, we only had the option to shoot in DLog or normal, and that was it. It was weird that HLG was missing because it was on the smaller, less capable Air 2S, and all of the previous professional level Mavic drones had this shooting mode or this color profile. In my daily shoots, I am a huge HLG user with all of the drones that I fly that have it, as I find that it gives me great dynamic range while also being a better starting point when I want to color grade my footage. Not having to use a LUT and being able to easily color grade from scratch fits my workflow of turning out multiple drone videos on the daily. But what's funny is with the Mavic 3, I'm actually kind of considering just sticking with the normal color profile because it is so good. I mean, the colors are spot on, the dynamic range is still great, and with the ability to shoot in high bit rates and even ProRes on the Mavic 3 Cine, there is plenty of room to push the exposure and colors around in post to where I need them. I'll put some raw HLG clips in a folder available for download in the description below if you want to play around with them a little bit on your own. Now the next addition here that I figured I'd mention is the ability to capture 1080p video at up to 200 frames per second, so just crazy super slow motion video. But really, when I'm flying drones, you guys probably know this if you've been following me for a while, I prefer to shoot in the highest resolution possible because I'm further away from my subject, so therefore I want to get the sharpest looking image that I can right out of the camera. And shooting 1080p I feel always gives me a soft looking image, so usually I'm a resolution over frame rate guy when it comes to flying drones and capturing drone video. But it is cool to know that this is in my back pocket in case I need it, and I'm trying to capture motion in an up close subject. Now continuing on down our list here, if you are a Mavic 3 Cine owner, you'll be happy to know that there is now 3 different versions of ProRes available to record in. If we jump into the menu here and scroll down, you'll now see that there is 3 total versions of ProRes, with the 2 new ones being 422 LT and 422. ProRes 422 HQ has been available since day 1 here on the Mavic 3 Cine. Capturing video in ProRes is very beneficial to those that want to work with an uncompressed video file. It allows them to edit the video faster. In some cases, it allows them to potentially push that video around further. And while I don't want to go into depth about the differences between 422 LT, 422, and 422 HQ, I do want to share some numbers with you. Using the built-in 1TB SSD as our metric, the DJI Fly app shows that we can record and store double the amount of video in the ProRes 422 LT video codec than we'd be able to in the ProRes 422 HQ codec, with ProRes 422 falling somewhere in the middle. This means that the overall file sizes are smaller, which could be better for a full day of filming where you don't have the ability to dump your footage, or for those that just don't want to store all the data that comes with recording in ProRes 422 HQ. Now moving on from here, if you are a DLog shooter, then you'll be happy to hear that there's now a color display assist feature that can be accessed from the camera settings. This gives you a preview of what your footage will look like after being color graded to help you expose your image without burning a LUT right into your video. So this just affects the video displayed to you and not the actual video that is saved to your onboard SSD or to the SD card. Now, one of my favorite yet also most hated accessories for the Mavic 3 was the wide angle lens. This is the one that was made directly by DJI for their drone, so it's made by the manufacturer. And sure, it gave you a really cool look. It was a nice wide angle field of view. Sometimes it could be cool for taking wider photos and wider video when you needed to fit more in the frame, but that didn't come with any trade-offs. In fact, there was a long list of trade-offs, and just to name a few that were probably the most annoying, sometimes the legs and body would get in the shot because the frame was so wide. Also, you had to deal with a lot of distortion that sometimes just looked unbearable, and also the intelligent flight features on the drone were completely disabled when using the wide-angle lens. Luckily, that has now been overturned, so when the wide-angle lens is attached, you can access modes like hyperlapse, master shots, focus track, and quick shots. I really was never sure why they disabled these in the first place. I mean, I guess I can understand why you can't take panos because the stitching software doesn't account for using a wider angle lens or a different, like, wider field of view on the camera. Also, I guess maybe I understood why you couldn't use active track because the drone had to track a subject, and if the frame was wider, the subject would be smaller, so I guess that could kind of be a trade-off. But something that I'm really looking forward to using this wide angle lens for in the future is hyperlapses. Now moving down our list here, there's a new feature within APAS 5.0 called Nifty Bypass. So if we jump into our settings menu, when selecting bypass under the flight assistant settings, you now have the option of normal or nifty. And if you switch over to nifty, it actually displays a warning that basically says, if you crash your drone, you are liable. So when I first heard about Nifty Bypass, of course my mind was spinning, like, what does this mean? So I asked DJI, like, hey, what does Nifty Bypass actually do? And they told me it basically smooths out the drone's movement during the bypass APAS 5.0 flight function so that when you're flying around, you can get smoother shots. That's all that I was told. So I thought, hey, that's a really good addition. Why not just smooth out the traditional APAS 5.0 flight software and just make it smooth right out of the gate? But now understanding that it's not as abrupt and probably isn't as good at dodging obstacles, I can now understand why you'd want to choose between the two of them. So look, I really don't use APAS all that often. I pretty much just have my obstacle avoidance set to brake rather than bypass because I'd rather dodge the obstacles myself. And usually when using APAS, the drone's top speed is lowered quite significantly. So regardless, I would say that if you are going to be using Nifty Bypass, just be careful. Now, the rest of the updates that are here on the patch notes pretty much pertain to remote controllers that are compatible and used with the Mavic 3 Cine. And I want to jump a little bit out of order and go to the second to last bullet point, and that is DJI RC compatibility. We didn't have to wait long for this one. This remote just released with the new Mini 3 Pro, and it's now already compatible with the Mavic 3 and the Mavic 3 Cine, which is awesome. Now, I actually just made a full overview video if you want to go and check it out, but to summarize my general thoughts of that video, I really like the smaller remote because it's lightweight, the ergonomics are on point, and the built-in screen is plenty bright. It's going to be interesting to see if DJI sells this as a bundle with the Mavic 3 moving forward, or if they will begin to sell it separately, but at least we have support for the remote with the Mavic 3 because I really do love this little remote. Now, putting this remote controller to the side and moving on to the big boy here, the DJI RC, they did make some improvements here with this controller. They actually took two of its biggest strengths and then improved them even more, making this thing even better than it already was. The first addition is an outdoor mode, which can be accessed by swiping down to the notification center. In the top right corner is a feature, of course, called outdoor mode that somehow further boosts the screen brightness for easier viewing outdoors when the sun is beating down on the screen. Like, you guys are now looking here side by side at at the live view from the drone with and without outdoor mode on, and while both of them are too bright for my camera to pick up any detail with these lighting conditions here inside, the outdoor mode makes it way brighter, which is something that I am definitely going to love taking advantage of. I'm not sure if I'm ever going to turn it off. Now moving on, but staying with the RC Pro, we now have further button customization, which reminds me of what we get on DJI's enterprise level drones. These drones have the ability to customize almost any button on the remote and create a custom function when multiple buttons are pressed simultaneously, making the remote even more powerful with the ability to access quick functions really fast. So if we go into the settings and head to the control section and then scroll down to button customization, we can now customize the back two custom buttons, and the top right button on the remote is now added as a third custom button. So this is now the C3 button. Scrolling down to the bottom, we can now also customize what happens when holding a specific custom button and scrolling the back right wheel. There's even more custom functions available for all of these buttons that were previously not there, with room for DJI to add even more in the future. This level of button customization is honestly mind-blowing, and quite frankly, when I first started going through all the different options, it was a little bit overwhelming. Like, I was trying to figure out, what should I make all of these buttons do? Now, after digging through the different custom options, this is what I've settled on for my custom button setup. So my C1 button is set to recenter the gimbal. That's the back left custom button. My C2 button on the back right side toggles the auxiliary LED on and off. The C3 button toggles between my 1x and 7x zoom. Scrolling down, the upper button on the 5D button here increases my EV, while pushing down lowers my EV or decreases my exposure value. If I push this left or right, it will recenter my gimbal, and if I push it inward, so down towards the remote controller, that will enable explore mode. Now the back right dial here is set to zoom in and out, and for my C1 button and right dial, I have this set to adjust my shutter speed. So when I hold the C button back here, or the C1 button, and I use this dial, it'll change the shutter speed. Instead, if I use the C2 and right dial, it'll adjust my aperture, and if I hold the C3 button and use that right dial, that'll adjust my ISO. And so guys, with that, the Mavic 3 is now what I am calling complete. This is the final firmware update that I think this drone really needs. We have all the features that were promised to us, all the features that really should have been there from day one. And part of me likes getting these firmware updates. Like, it's really cool that I can continue to see my drone do new and different things as I update it, and it's getting more powerful as it goes on. But then another part of me is like, hey, I just wish that DJI would release all these features from day one, right from the get-go. So I'm kind of on the fence there. I feel like what would be cool is, like, if they came out with all the features we know the drone can do on day one, and then surprised us with new updates every, say, quarter, for example, and introduced features that we didn't know this drone could do. I mean, adding HLG and adding raw photo support for the telephoto camera, sure, that's great, but should have been there from the beginning. But something like adding, you know, the custom buttons, the customization now in the DJI RC Pro, that's something that was unexpected. Adding compatibility this early for the DJI RC, that was unexpected. So those things are really cool and really exciting, but getting things like HLG and raw photo support, I mean, yeah, it's cool, it's exciting, but also should have been there from the beginning. Anyway, guys, hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts of this new firmware update down below, and as always, I'll talk to you later. Peace.